establishment does, so I'll give you the answer, then you can ask the question. How's that? What the establishment does, in many, many different ways, is to tell you that you're not really smart enough or experienced enough or capable enough to get involved in politics. Leave it to other people. Leave it to the Koch brothers and their candidates. They'll take care of you. Needless to say, I hope we all believe the opposite. Politics is tough stuff. You're not going to win the first time out, perhaps, but it is important that you study the issues, you bring people together. In 2 weeks, my Republican colleagues are going to be very surprised, because in hundreds of places around this country, their constituents are going to be asking their members of Congress and their senators some very hard questions. The Women's March of a few weeks ago, where millions... Extraordinary. Extraordinary. My own state of Vermont, I never saw anything like it. We had about 15,000 people out at our state capitol. Millions of people all over this country. So the answer is, understand that there is an establishment that does not want you to be involved. Your job is to be involved.
That answer goes to Stephen Broadwater and Emma Hensley. Thank you for your questions. Here's a question that I think came from the Advocates for a Safe Water System. You mentioned Flint. In January of 2014, over 300,000 residents of Kanawha County were poisoned, and their water was contaminated by MCHM, a coal chemical. If you were a resident or official in Charleston, would you support a fight to make the water system publicly owned and operated, and how?
Is the water system here not publicly owned? No. Yeah, of course I would. I mean, water is a pretty basic necessity. We don't survive without it. We need to make sure that what we're drinking is clean. We need to make sure that people are not making profits off a very basic necessity.
Okay, we have a question from Valerie. West Virginia has the highest rate of overdose deaths in the U.S. If you were an ordinary West Virginian like us, what would you do to help our community recover?
Well, this is a tragedy, and I know that West Virginia has been hit hard by it. So has my state, and so have communities all over this country. And I touched on a little bit. I think the first question that we have to ask ourselves is why? Why are people turning to opiates and to heroin in my state? I think it was last week, 3 people died in one small town from heroin mixed with God knows what. So we have a national crisis right here. But second of all, obviously, we have got to make treatment available to everybody who needs it, regardless of their income. Breaking an addiction is not an easy thing. But in the long run, from a human point of view, as well as being cost effective, treatment is the very best approach. And we need, it shouldn't have anything to do with how much money you have. All people should be entitled to break their addictions. And right now, there is no question, actually Vermont is beginning to do a pretty good job on this, but there is no question that we just don't have the kind of myriad of treatments that we need to deal with this national crisis.
Here's a question from Kimberly. It's a good one. Could you speak to people about the way to advocate that will make the biggest impact to their elected officials? What makes you listen to your constituents the most? Is it calling, writing, marching? Please share some strategies to help us work smarter, not harder, or even worse, turn into white noise to our elected officials.
Good question. And the answer is all of the above plus some. It does matter. During the period when Betsy DeVos was being debated, the telephone lines in Washington, D.C. were overwhelmed. All right? Now, with the exception, and in fact, 2 Republicans were turned around, the senator from Maine and the senator from Alaska. And while the other Republicans did vote for DeVos, do not think that they were not shaken by the number of calls that they got, knowing that people felt very strongly about that issue. So I think emailing and calling and writing is very important. But I'll tell you something else. And again, I'm getting back to something we're working on right now on the 25th. And that is holding meetings. Organize the meetings yourself and invite your elected officials to discuss the important issue with you. If you have people who want to end the Affordable Care Act, invite them to a meeting where a few thousand West Virginians are there. Let's hear what they have to say. Bad decisions are made. Lobbyists win. The big money interests win when members of Congress think nobody knows what's going on. When you stand up and you fight back, we will make real change.
Here's a question from Steve about trade. He says, I'd like to question you about trade agreements. I've always thought that a trade agreement should include worker rights, environmental protections, and consumer protections. For instance, a cancer-causing pesticide that is outlawed in this country, if used on food grown in another country, should not be allowed. He goes on to talk about child labor pollution. He says, I read a little of the TPP agreement, and it seemed to deal with stuff like child labor, workers' rights, and environmental protections. What specifically was the problem with it, and what, in your opinion, would make it a good trade agreement?
I have voted since I've been in Congress against every major trade agreement, and I believe that was exactly the right thing to do. Now, we have lost, in the last 15 years, 60,000 factories in America. Not all of it attributable to trade. But here are the objections, just 2 briefly with regard to the TPP. Number 1, American workers would be forced to compete against people in Vietnam, where the minimum wage is 50 or 60 cents an hour. And that's just unfair to American workers. Number 2, there is a provision in it which says that says that a company has the right to sue a government, local, state, or federal, if that government does something which hampers and lessens their future profitability. So, for example, if you're in a state and the state passes environmental legislation which will impact the profits of that company, that foreign company, they can actually go to a 3-person tribunal, international tribunal, and sue you and say, how dare you pass environmental legislation which cause us profits. The most obscene example, and it turned out okay, but the most obscene example was Philip Morris suing the country of Uruguay, tiny little country, because they worked hard on trying to prevent kids from smoking tobacco. And Philip Morris went to this tribunal and said, if kids don't smoke cigarettes and get addicted, our profits are hurt. We are going to sue. That was an extreme example of an absurd provision. Last question.
Last question. This comes from Luca and his mother. I'm a parent of an 8-year-old who's been to more rallies, protests, conferences, and marches in his short life than he cares to remember. At the recent women's march, my son was initially very happy, but after an hour or so impatiently asked, "Can we leave yet?" So we were wondering, since my son and certainly other children are here tonight, can you take a moment to speak directly to the young people in the audience and give them some good advice about what they can do to help their parents, guardians, teachers, and community leaders make the world a better place?
Thank you. And the answer is pretty simple. If you look at the history of our country, if you look at how workers were able to form unions and earn decent wages, if you look at how we did away with child labor, 150 years ago, children were not in school, they were in factories and in the fields. If you, in the coal mines, that's right. If you look at the struggle of women, not only to get the right to vote, but also to do the work that they want to do. If you look at the struggle of the African American community, decade after decade, people were lynched, were beaten, were jailed. But at the end of the day, because millions of workers stood up and fought for dignity for all, for women who stood up and fought, for the gay community that stood up and fought, we made real progress in America. The only way, Dan, and I believe this from the bottom of my heart, the only way that real change ever takes place is from the bottom on up, never from the top on down. So I say to those young people, we can be so much more. We don't have to have 43 million people living in poverty. We don't have to have kids who can't afford to go to college. We don't have to have water systems that are polluted. These are solvable problems. But in order to solve them, we're gonna have to do one very big thing. Not easy. We're gonna have the guts to take on a billionaire class whose greed is doing us so much harm. Let me just conclude as I began. This has been a wonderful, wonderful meeting, and I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed the book. Thank you all.